Welcome you to this lecture by Dr. Timothy White. Dr. White has his master's degree from the University of Missouri at Columbia, the Political Science Department. He has his PhD from the University of Michigan, where he studied comparative politics. And later in his career, he focused on studying, how can I describe, the political economy and culture of Ireland, and has written about 45 publications focusing on politics and the economy in all sorts of journals, New Hibernian Review, Irish Journal Sociology. There's a whole list here. But very, very interesting topics that he covers. And the latest work that I want to tell you about is this book here, Lessons from the Northern Ireland Peace Process. It's an edited collection, and it has contributions by distinguished scholars who have looked at recent Irish history and other aspects of the Ireland peace process from different perspectives. And we have some that are for sale. It's a paperback, and if you want to look through it and perhaps buy it at the end of the lecture, you're welcome to. But anyway, Professor White teaches at Xavier University in Cincinnati in the Political Science Department. And his talk today, no surprise, is going to be entitled, here we go, Lessons from the Northern Ireland Peace Process. So please welcome Professor White.
It's great to be back at Mizzou. I grew up in St. Louis and enjoyed my 2 years here where I worked on my master's back in the 1980s. It's strange being on a campus 30 years later. You're not sure if you changed or the campus changed, or a lot of both probably, but it's wonderful to be back, and I appreciate you coming out on a beautiful mid-Missouri evening here to listen to a lecture. I'm sure you'd rather be finding out what the Cardinals did or whatever else is going on out there. So I appreciate you coming tonight. I'm going to talk a lot about what the book covers, and the book was called Lessons from the Northern Ireland Peace Process. And what the book tries to do is bring scholars together from Canada, the United States, England, and Ireland, North and South, to talk about what we've learned about this peace process. And when I was in school 30 years ago, I remember a professor telling me that Northern Ireland was one of the intractable conflicts of the world. It couldn't be solved. Very similar today to what you might hear about the Arab-Israeli conflict or some other regional conflict in the world that's so difficult and challenging. Come on in, there's room up here, you just got to come to the front. It's so challenging that it can't be solved. Well, Northern Ireland defied, in a sense, those negative predictions. And even though I'm going to argue we don't have a perfect peace by any means in Northern Ireland today, the situation is dramatically better. And we're going to talk about what's been achieved in the North, as well as what hasn't been, and what needs to still be done to promote a more complete sense of peace in Northern Ireland. I use this photo, it's a long history of how this photo became on the cover of the book. It's a very famous photo if you come from Ireland, because the person shaking the hand of the lady is a man named Martin McGuinness. He's the Deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland, and he's an admitted commander of the IRA going back to the 1970s. Now, he claimed he'd left the IRA relatively early in his career. Not everybody agrees with that assessment, but that's what he claims. And he's shaking the lady in the hat's hand. And one reason why I chose this photo is one of my colleagues in Ireland said, that woman is the most recognized person in the world. And you need to put on the cover of your book, the most recognized person. Apparently, most people in China know who she is, India, big countries all over the world, many Africans know where she is. So that's Queen Elizabeth. This is very significant because she's the head of state of the United Kingdom, and this man for years tried to get the British out of Northern Ireland through using violence as a commander in the IRA, and then politically through his political party Sinn Féin. When I was negotiating over this photo with the University of Wisconsin Press for the cover, they wanted to delete the person in the middle, and I had to convince them. I actually had to drive to Madison, Wisconsin to convince them that not to alter the photo, to keep it as it actually happened. And this may be staged, but actually did happen, where the Queen shook Martin's hand. But the man looking down at Martin and kind of smiling is Peter Robinson. And he's the first minister of Northern Ireland. He's the leader of the largest Protestant party the Democratic Unionist Party. And the fact that a Protestant is smiling as the Catholic shakes the hand of the Queen, it means a lot. It says a lot about where we've been in the peace process. So tonight what I want to cover are 10 lessons that I think are the major ones that scholars who've looked at this peace process have talked about. And I'll be integrating the different chapters of the book as we go along. First, when we think about this from a social science perspective and from a peace studies perspective, it's important to recognize that none of the authors, nor do I, believe that there is a single model of how peace gets built. The attempts to make the world more peaceful and to eradicate conflicts or minimize conflicts and build peace are incredibly complex. And the literature is just beginning to address the complexity of how you try to achieve an end to conflicts like Northern Ireland. So we're not arguing that Northern Ireland is a cookie-cutter case that can be seen and then just replicated everywhere else in the world where there is a conflict. What we're going to be arguing is that there are aspects of what happened in Northern Ireland that are instructive, and that we might look at those aspects to try to figure out what worked and what didn't work in Northern Ireland, and to what extent those might work in other conflicts, not just to easily or quickly replicate what happens. The first lesson, and this is repeating sort of the difficulties of lesson learning, is that various groups learn different lessons. In political science, a popular theme of IR literature based on constructivism today emphasizes that each actor in a conflict or in world politics comes from their own different traditions, history, and perspectives. And to understand what happened in Northern Ireland, you can't think they're all the same. They're all extremely different based on their own traditions, history, senses of trust or often mistrust with other actors. And to understand what happened in the peace process, in some ways this is the most amazing part, is to understand how their senses of identity changed over time, how their policy positions, how their sense of who they were evolved based on the evolutionary process of peace building in Northern Ireland. So chapter 2 is written by a colleague of mine. He teaches at Miami of Ohio named Will Hazelton. He was born on the 12th of July as a Protestant in Northern Ireland. You're not going to be named anything other than William, so he was named William Hazelton. And Hazelton argues that when we think about Northern Ireland, we should realize that he calls it lessons best learned at home. That we need to understand how each actor, Protestants in Northern Ireland, Catholics in Northern Ireland, the Irish government, the British government, the US government, any other actor you'd want to cite in this peace process, each came at this from their own perspectives, and they learned very different lessons. They didn't all learn the same lesson from the exact same process, based on where they started, where they came from, and where they ended up. And he starts his chapter quoting from this speech, and we're going to try to see if I can get the speech to come up.
When I go now to other troubled places, I point to you as proof that peace is not an idle daydream. For your peace is real, and it resonates around the world. It echoes in the ears of people hungry for the end of strife in their own country.
What President Clinton is saying in this speech, and it was famously, he said it in Armagh, which was near a town of Omaha, just a month or so, a month and a half after a famous bombing, after the agreement was signed in 1998. He's encouraging the peace process to move on. He's saying the world is looking at you as an example. And what Hazelton argues is President Clinton got it right. That we should see Northern Ireland as an example of how to get it right, as an exemplar, but not a copy, a process that is going to be easily copied or replicated anywhere else in the world. So we need to understand who these different actors were and how they played a part in this peace process. And I'm assuming none of you know these people, so if those of you who are familiar with these characters, I apologize, but I think it's important for the students who aren't familiar with them to kind of go over the major players and how they evolved and played a role in the peace process. This man was extremely important. His name was John Hume. Hume was the leader from the 1970s to the 1990s of the largest Catholic party in Northern Ireland. They were called the Social Democratic and Labour Party. His party was committed to nonviolence and peace, so very much differentiated from the IRA. He never supported Catholics going out and bombing either Protestants or the British Army. he devised a way of thinking about Northern Ireland that transformed what you might think of as a boundary dispute. If you see Northern Ireland as an issue of boundaries and what territory should Northern Ireland belong to, the United Kingdom or the Republic of Ireland, he argued that if we focus just on its territorial nature, we would get nowhere, because one piece of territory, under the ideas of how we think of sovereignty today, can't be part of the United Kingdom and part of United Ireland at the same time. So to move beyond that, Hume said, we need to think about politics as relationships. And he focused on three sets of relationships that became the three strands of the agreement. The first strand, or relationship, was between the Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland. How can we create institutions to improve the relationships between Catholics and Protestants? And this eventually created a new governing system based on our Parliament in Stormont, the suburb of Belfast. The Assembly was created to represent the people, allow Catholics and Protestants to share power institutionally in this new Parliament. A second strand was the North-South relationship. Within Ireland, how can people in the northern part of Ireland and the southern part of Ireland relate better to each other? Strand 2 called for creating ministerial relationships so that the Minister of Tourism in Northern Ireland would meet periodically with the Minister of Tourism in the southern part of Ireland, and they could coordinate strategies to get you to come over to Ireland every summer, north and south. Or the agricultural ministers could get together and talk about common challenges like foot and mouth disease or other issues that might confront agricultural farmers in both northern and southern Ireland. So the idea was to improve north-south relations. And a third relationship was a relationship between the island of Ireland and the island of the United Kingdom. How can we improve that relationship? That was the third strand. And there was a Council of the Isles created in the agreement that ultimately resulted from the negotiations in Good Friday 1998. So Hume was a political visionary. He was also a great negotiator. He was a tenacious person that was willing to take great risks for peace, meeting with people who he considered terrorists, like leaders of Sinn Féin in the 1980s, secretly, to try to get them engaged in the peace process and lead them in a way that ultimately brought about an agreement. Another major leader who won the Nobel Peace Prize along with John Hume was this man, David Trimble. He was leader of the largest Protestant party during the peace process, the Ulster Unionist Party. And Trimble was selected in 1995 for by this party, not because he was some kind of peacenik, but because he was seen as a hardliner, as someone who wouldn't make unnecessary concessions to Catholics, the Irish government, or anybody else. He was committed to the union of Northern Ireland with the United Kingdom. Okay? But in some ways, Hume was a very astute politician. He said, if our ultimate goal as a unionist is to preserve the union of Northern Ireland and the United Kingdom, everything else is negotiable. Those are secondary concerns. So for him, the fact that the agreement solidified and states that the Northern Ireland territory is part of the United Kingdom and can only be changed based on democratic processes conforms to unionist ultimate goals, you can argue. And whether they have to share power with Catholics or other concessions that were made were secondary. These were very unpopular with many Protestant other politicians as well as Protestant constituents of his, because they didn't want to make any concessions. They were used to having a monopoly of power, or at least the vast majority of power they didn't have to share with Catholics. This required them to reimagine how they related to Catholics in a political structure that was tough for many Protestants to believe in. So he took great risks for peace as well. He ultimately won a share of the Nobel Peace Prize for it. In the end, he became very unpopular. He lost his seat in the Northern Ireland Assembly. He lost his seat in the British House of Commons. He lost his leadership of his own party, the Ulster Unionist Party, but he was rewarded, and he now sits in the House of Lords. So you shouldn't be too sorry for David Trimble, because he's sitting in the House of Lords today. Another major party which played a key role was Sinn Féin, led by this man, Gerry Adams. Sinn Féin was the party that is seen as the political arm of the Irish Republican Army, the Catholic paramilitaries that were engaged in violence during the Troubles in the 1970s and 80s. And Adams had written about how he believed that political violence could be used in order to defeat the British Army and force them to leave in what he called the Long War. Ultimately, by the early 80s, Sinn Féin begins to recalculate their political strategy. They come to believe that in what was called a ballots and bullets strategy, they could both bomb and try to get electoral votes and support. And by the 1980s, based on negotiations with John Hume, pressure from the Irish government, to some extent pressure and support from the American government led by Bill Clinton, he convinces the IRA to have a ceasefire and try to negotiate after a ceasefire. And ultimately they agree to the Good Friday Agreement and learn to share power and renounce violence as a political option or as a strategy for achieving their goals for a united Ireland. A remarkable transformation. I wouldn't call it a defeat, but it was an evolution of strategy of what they considered the correct political means to try to gain their goals in Ireland. The British government played a very important role in the initial stages of the peace process. The British government was led by this leader, John Major, from 1990 to 1997. He was Prime Minister. And Major allowed the British government to begin to recalculate the fact that they could engage with Sinn Féin as a political actor. Initially engaged, he made some mistakes, many people argue, but he clearly set a framework by which the British started saying things like, we have no selfish or strategic interest in Northern Ireland. They believed and publicly enunciated the principle of majority consent, which meant that if a majority of people in Northern Ireland no longer wanted to be in the United Kingdom, they were free under democratic processes to join a united Ireland if they voted that way. So those were major ways of reformulating the strategy or the ideas of what the interest of the British government was in Northern Ireland. He ultimately was replaced in 1997 by this man, Tony Blair, who played the key role in negotiating the Good Friday Agreement of 1998. Blair writes a lot about his role, and almost all the politicians who have written their memoirs about their role in the peace process play up their own, of course, incredibly important role, because it was inconceivable without them, right? But to be fair to Blair, he engaged in certain strategies that, when we look back on it, are often seen as very successful or important. For example, one scholar argues that Tony Blair purposely would say things to certain audiences he knew not to be true in order to keep the peace process going. He didn't mean to lie, or his goal wasn't lying just for lying's sake. His goal was to try to convince people to move ahead. And if they focused on that which they disagreed with at that point, the negotiations and the peace process would have stalled. So momentum he considered extremely important. So he's willing to engage in what scholars call constructive ambiguity, or outright honorable deception or lying, in order to keep the peace process going. He also says he was more than willing to take personal attacks, and people call him names and shout at him in anger because he was pushing the peace process faster than some members who, of the Protestant community especially, wanted it to go. So Blair gets huge credit. The Irish government in Dublin also played a very big role, starting in the early 90s, led by this Taoiseach, or it's Irish for Prime Minister, named Albert Reynolds. And Reynolds pushed and promoted, first encouraging John Major to engage in the peace process, supporting moderate nationalists like John Hume in Northern Ireland, and cajoling Republicans and trying to convince Adams and other Republicans, because the Irish government actually never even indirectly negotiated with Sinn Féin until this guy became Taoiseach. They viewed it as too dangerous to be supporting negotiations, what were called terrorist at the time. So there were secret negotiations between his government representatives and Sinn Féin during this time frame, trying to promote the idea of peace as much as possible. He was replaced later. There was a Taoiseach in between, but the key Taoiseach in charge of the negotiations of the Good Friday Agreement was this man named Bertie Ahern. And Bertie saw his role as trying to, very similar to his predecessor Albert Reynolds, of promote the moderates like the SDLP, the Catholic Moderate Nationalist Party, convince the British to trust Sinn Féin and other more radical Irish nationalists, and he was ready to make a big change. When the Irish Constitution was written in the 1930s, it stated that the government of Ireland had complete control of all the land and territorial sea of the island of Ireland. Now, de facto, that was not true. These northeast 6 counties in Ireland were part of the United Kingdom, and the Irish government knew that. But as an Irish nationalist, they believed, as Irish nationalists, that they should have control over the whole of Ireland. He was willing to change Articles 2 and 3 of their constitution as part of this peace process. And the Good Friday Agreement actually called for this to be done. So one of the things that the Good Friday Agreement was a formal treaty between the United Kingdom, that government, and this government of Ireland to change the constitutional makeup of what Ireland claimed the territory that they had. They rescinded their claim to part of their own country, which is not easy for people who have a national identity to do. The third chapter of the book starts the process of trying to explain how people's identities begin to change. It's written by Leonard Hancock from Kent State University. Hancock relies on social psychology theories that explain identity formation and change over time. And his basic thesis is, based on one graph in the chapter, that there were two key moments which allowed both Protestants and Catholics to recalculate who they were themselves and how they related to the other community in Northern Ireland. And these were first, and you see the first blip, and these are based on surveys, right after the 1994 ceasefire. There was a great increase in the hope and expectation that relations between Catholics and Protestants would improve in the next 5 years. That went down after the ceasefire fell apart and bombings continued in 96 and 97. But in 1998, you see an increase again, in which expectations of improved relations continued. These two key events allowed people to rethink how they had learned, in a sense, to hate the other, right? During the time of the Troubles, as day after day, Catholics were killing Protestants, Protestants were then killing Catholics, it reinforced a sense of fear, anxiety, grief, all kinds of negative emotions towards the other side. If you could end the period of violence, those kinds of feelings and attachments towards the other would gradually dissipate, and you could reconstruct your sense of the other as well as the sense of yourself as not being so reactionary or oppositional in terms of how you identified yourself. In the fourth chapter, these two scholars from John Carroll University try to give an example of how one of the groups in Northern Ireland began to re-identify themselves. And they use an interesting way of thinking about how you can redefine your own sense of identity, focusing on unionists in Northern Ireland. And their thesis is that there were, as they perceive it, and this is based on the publications of an organization called it's called USA, the Ulster Scots Agency, which was created by the Good Friday Agreement, which tries to promote, in a sense, a redefinition of unionist identity in Northern Ireland. And they talk about three different dispersals. The first dispersal was when people from Scotland came to Ireland. And we're fortunate to have Professor Kirby Miller here tonight, who knows far more about this than probably anybody that I know. But this is a famous period where people migrated from Scotland to Northern Ireland, and they came to have a certain sense of identity based on that process. They were mostly Presbyterians, and they were people who felt a sense of grief and anxiety based on that process. They were part of what we would call a dissenting set of Protestants. The dominant church of Northern Ireland was the Church of Ireland, or the Church of England in Ireland. So these people weren't a part of the dominant church, and they felt discriminated against because of their status. They felt isolated and surrounded by Catholics. And they suffered certain key events, like a massacre in 1641 and the Siege of Derry in 1689, that are as fresh to these people today as something that happened yesterday. So these events may seem like a long time ago, but these are etched in stone into the memory and identity of Unionists. And it gives them what Arthur Haughey calls a siege mentality, a sense that they're under siege. Okay? The second dispersal was when these people that came from Scotland to Ulster then migrate to America. And they migrated in huge waves in the 17th century, primarily into the early 18th century. And they become what we call primarily, the most common name in the U.S. you hear is Scots-Irish. They're people who were Protestants, who migrated from Northern Ireland, usually settled or landed in Philadelphia, and then migrated along the Appalachian region of the United States, and gradually became the core of sort of early America. I mean, most of early American colonists were these Ulster Scots, or at least many of them came from this background. And in some ways, because they migrated so early, when we think of the Irish today, we tend to think of the Irish who migrated more recently, rather than these earlier Protestant settlers who came to America. What Weidenhoff, Murphy, and Peden argue in Chapter 4 is that what we're experiencing now is what they call the third dispersal, as people in Northern Ireland reimagine how they're connected to the Ulster Scots in America, and how this migration is impacting their own sense of identity. And their basic thesis is that instead of defining themselves primarily by how terrible the other side is, and if you look at the famous murals on the gables in Northern Ireland, you see image, and this is a relatively not-violent image compared to what usually is on the walls, of how one group or the other, Catholics or Protestants, are depicting the need to kill and destroy the other side of the community, the other community. They witnessed the arrival, because of the peace process, of a whole new wave of paintings that have come onto gables, sometimes covering up the earlier violent ones, sometimes new walls that have been painted that depict, in a sense, the migration of Ulster Scots to America, and how that's increasingly becoming part of their identity. And they would argue that offers the opportunity to replace the historic animosity they had towards Catholics with a sense of achievement of their own group that migrated to America. So this painting is one of depicting that migration of the second dispersal of Ulster Scots leaving Northern Ireland, coming to America, depicted with the Statue of Liberty here. And there's lots of images of the contributions of these Ulster Scots to early America. So you see here figures like Andrew Jackson, Uncle Sam, Davy Crockett, Daniel Boone, many sort of almost mythological characters in American history that played a role in constructing who we are. And the quote here is that they write, "Hi, Uncle Sam, wherever there was fighting, a wrong that needs a righting, an Ulster man was sighting his Kentucky gun with care. All the road to Yorktown, that Ulsterman was there." So it emphasizes the great achievements of Ulster Scots when they came to America, building American society. And another interesting quote that is on one of the gables, this is President Buchanan, and I don't teach American history, but I don't think he's one that most people tend to spend a lot of time on, but his name is a classic Ulster Scots name. But he was quoted as saying, "My Ulster blood is my most priceless heritage." Okay? To Ulster Scots today, this shows an American president really thinks being from Ulster is really important to who he is, that we're important in America. So this was a way of redefining who they were. And as part of this process, there's also been the creation of an Ulster American folk park in Omagh that features Appalachian culture and lifestyle to show the contributions of these Ulster Scots when they came to America and how they're trying to reconnect with this historic group of people who still live in Northern Ireland, whose ancestors migrated to America. So this is an example of how identities can be transformed by a peace process. People might start thinking of themselves, instead of just being anti-Catholic, hating Catholics, to understanding the contributions of their own group in a historical framework, perhaps more positively. Most of the rest of the lessons I'm going to talk about today are more generalized lessons that aren't unique to different actors in Northern Ireland, but contribute to a greater sense of how we might see peace processes more generally in the world today. This is quite controversial, but most scholars, and especially the ones we have in this book, would say that it's important in negotiating to be as inclusive as all parties in peace. And Paul Dixon who wrote chapter 5, argues against the neoconservative claim that you should defeat terrorists first and never talk to them. Only negotiate after you've defeated them, then you can make peace. He argues this is not what happened in Northern Ireland. What happened was a slow process by which all the sides learned the other side couldn't be defeated. It was either a herding stalemate, as Zartman calls these episodes, or some scholars who study Northern Ireland call it a learning process, where you learn that you aren't going to defeat them, and you learn to gradually trust the other party that you're in conflict with enough to negotiate a peace. But it definitely is not one that is based on never talking to terrorists. The British talked to the terrorists the entire time. They were denying they talked to the terrorists. That was just reality. Related to this is that when you start negotiations, there should be as few preconditions as possible. And the example that is cited in the case of Northern Ireland comes from Jonathan Powell, who was the chief of staff to Tony Blair, who highly criticizes John Major because when the IRA committed its first ceasefire in 1994, Major refused to negotiate until the IRA decommissioned. Powell and Blair, I think, agree that this was an unnecessary precondition. And if you look at the history of diplomatic engagement, often the creation of preconditions prevents any actual diplomacy from happening because the parties don't even agree to talk to each other about what their differences are. They're so angry and upset and hostile to each other, they won't engage. So you have to get past preconditions. You have to accept basically as much as possible people where they are, even if some people have historically used violence, because you don't get peace until the people who are using violence stop doing it. I mean, that's what peace is in some sense. Providing security is huge in peace process. If you look at many African countries that have experienced attempts at peace building and peacemaking in the last couple decades, they've often collapsed because one or more of the factions involved refuses to disarm, feels as if they do disarm and give over their weapons, they'll be attacked by the other group in society. How do you disarm a society with paramilitaries so that everybody feels still safe after they give up their guns? This is not easy to do. The way it was done in Northern Ireland, we talk about in Chapter 6 by John Doyle of Dublin City University, is that what you need to do is create an international process that all sides believe is honest and fair. This isn't easy to do. It was created in Northern Ireland by a commission. It was called the International Independent Commission on Policing of Northern Ireland. It popularly was called the Patton Commission because the man in the top center here, Chris Patton, was its chair. But it was a 7-person commission. I just show four images here of the members of the commission. But they included international people. Like Kathleen O'Toole was on the Boston Police Council. Clifford Shearing was a famous criminologist from South Africa. Maurice Hayes was an elder statesman from Ireland. They were people from all different kinds of countries with expert backgrounds who understood the professional nature of how policing should work. So that when they went out and had literally hundreds of hearings all over Northern Ireland to hear all the complaints people had about what worked or didn't work about Northern Irish policing. So that when they made their recommendations, everybody thought they had a chance to be heard, and they tried to be as possible. There were many elements of the reforms of policing. These included, probably most importantly, changing the name. This may not seem significant, but the name historically was the Royal Ulster Constabulary. This name reeks to Catholics of Protestantism. It was an unacceptable name, and it was linked often with RUC collusion with Protestant paramilitaries and with discriminatory policing patterns against Catholics. 99% of Catholics reported being harassed by the RUC. So it was inconceivable that that organization would ever be seen as acceptable. So you had to rename it, retrain it. The commission called for the police officers who had the worst records of violating Catholic rights to be early retired. So they got rid of the people who were most controversial in the police, and they called for a variety of other police reforms, like requiring all new classes to be 50% Catholic, 50% Protestant, because historically over 90% of the police were Protestants. So therefore, they were a foreign force coming into Catholic neighborhoods. Another key aspect of creating security is you had to get rid of the weapons that paramilitaries had. And there was an independent international commission chaired by this man from Quebec, General John de Chastelain, who was in charge of decommissioning weapons. And while this didn't go perfectly, it was very slow and arduous and difficult. He gained credibility by himself, and there was a Finnish general and other generals from other countries who supervised that the IRA, as the dominant Catholic paramilitary group, put their weapons beyond use. And this was important because if you think about the logic of how the British might have wanted to do it, they might have just wanted the IRA to turn the weapons over to the British government. But the IRA would have seen that as surrender. If you turn it over to this independent commission, that's somehow less egregious than having to surrender your weapons to the people you were there to fight against. So these international bodies played an important role in helping build security in the wake of the agreement. These are some of the images of the IRA and some of the weapons that they had stored. The role of third parties should not be exaggerated. There is a huge literature in poli-sci and IR about what role third parties play in peace processes. There is no universal lesson to be learned because sometimes third parties help, sometimes they actually hurt, sometimes they come in too early to conflict, sometimes they come in too late. It's very hard to generalize. What happened in the case of Northern Ireland? Mary Alice Clancy, who's now at the University of Aberdeen, I think is the most prolific scholar thus far on writing about what happened in terms of the U.S. role. So she wrote this chapter looking at the U.S. role under both Presidents Clinton and President Bush. Clinton was very famously heavily involved personally in the peace process. He selected a very effective mediator to be first a person to establish rules for decommissioning and then lead the negotiations that finalized in the agreement. That was former Senator George Mitchell, pictured here under President Clinton. And this was an important point of emphasis in the Clinton presidency. It's estimated that in the first Clinton term, his National Security Council spent 1/3 of their man hours working on Northern Ireland. Okay? This is a territory with only 1.5 million people in a country of billions of people, and they spent 1/3 of their time on Northern Ireland. So there was a lot of personal work by the president himself, emissaries or envoys like George Mitchell, as well as people in the staff, especially Nancy Soderberg, who pretty much worked full-time just on Northern Ireland. So there was a heavy investment by the American government. George Bush becomes president in 2001. Typically, he's from a different party. He thinks pretty much everything Clinton did was wrong, so he de-emphasizes the U.S. role. He appoints Richard Haas as his envoy, but he simultaneously gave Haas the job in the State Department as in charge of policy planning, which is one of the biggest jobs in the State Department. So being envoy was clearly second fiddle, not that important. I'm sure 90% of Haas's time was not spent on Northern Ireland. And Bush himself was much less involved. One of the guy who wrote the foreword to this book, Martin Manzer, accompanied the Taoiseach, Bertie Ahern, to St. Patrick's Day. Every St. Patrick's Day, the Irish Taoiseach gives our president a bowl of shamrock flowers, and the American president wears a green tie, and they take a photo and all that nice stuff. When they did this in 2001, this is before 9/11, on March 17, 2001, George Bush told the Irish government, the Taoiseach and his advisors, famously that, feel free to call me anytime, I'm not very busy. The Irish were outraged that an American president would tell them that he wasn't very busy. And what he really meant was, this was not a point of his, he wasn't really focusing on this, he didn't care. Clancy argues that because Bush was in many ways disengaged from Northern Ireland, because once 9/11 happens, he's worried about Al-Qaeda, Iraq, Afghanistan, many other areas are pressing concerns. He defers the policy making to these envoys. They unilaterally decide what U.S. policy is. Haas leaves the administration over disagreements with Bush about the Iraq War. So in 2003, he leaves, and he's replaced by this man, Mitchell Reese. Mitchell Reese would be a typical kind of neoconservative American who didn't like terrorists. They think terrorists are bad. You never negotiate with terrorists. And he became what's seen by Mary Alice Clancy in this chapter as sort of the bad cop who convinces the IRA after 9/11, we will not tolerate you not decommissioning. You've got to get rid of your weapons. We were not going to allow you to continue to have stashes of weapons anymore. If you're going to become part of a peaceful political process, that means you need to get rid of your weapons. And she sees that as being important in pushing the IRA to actually finish off the decommissioning process once they started. Lesson 6, economic aid is important. There's a lot of discussion in different peace processes is when peace happens, people have to feel like things get better. You have to feel like there's a peace dividend, some people call this, where after a conflict ends, people get jobs, they have hope, they have a future, right? If poverty remains rampant, if especially young males who might become paramilitaries in certain situations feel disillusioned and angry, maybe violence will reemerge. So from the beginning, economic aid through both the American Ireland program as well as the EU's multiple aid programs has tried to be part of a multi-track peace process. And in chapter 8, Sean Bird of the University of Manitoba and 4 of his graduate students wrote about what the role of external economic aid is. And it's very difficult to prove what role economic aid did in Northern Ireland. Some are quite skeptical. On the other hand, the money that's being spent often is spent on local community centers in low-income areas, trying to get young men especially who are unemployed, skills, or engaged in ways that they otherwise might not end up getting outraged about flags coming down in Belfast or decide that they need to form a new faction of the IRA. So it's a way of trying to minimize potential spoilers to the peace process, as it's called. Another lesson we focus a lot on is the need for reconciliation. And this is probably, if you think about the peace process in Northern Ireland, I think there's been two major phases. The first was negotiating a settlement in 1998, but we're 15, 16 years past that now. What's happened since? And one of the ironies is we supposedly have peace in Northern Ireland, but there's more walls today in Northern Ireland separating Catholics and Protestants than there were in 1998. If you have to build walls to separate peoples, they're not really like establishing a normal, you know, what de Tocqueville or Robert Putnam would call civil society, social capital, right? You want a society where people can engage each other in a more normal interaction than having to never see each other because they're behind walls in different neighborhoods. So we spent some time, and I co-wrote this chapter with two of my former students. One is Andy Oziak at Georgia. He's got the Bulldog, an SEC rival here at the zoo now. And another student of mine who's a professional mediator, Megan Clark. And we talk about the need for reconciliation. And our work here builds upon a famous peace theorist. Those of you who are peace studies students should be familiar with Lederach's triangle. And we argue that most of the peace process has been focused on the top level leaders. I've talked about the leaders of these political parties and heads of government. But to get true peace, and Lederach was, I think, very insightful in this, you need to get these middle range leaders and grassroots leaders to overcome the historic sectarian or communal divide in Northern Ireland. And we've seen too little of this. Not because some people haven't been trying, but whatever has happened thus far hasn't, or whatever's been tried thus far, hasn't been that effective in overcoming this historic divide. There is hope. In this chapter we refer to some of the surveys that have come out of the Northern Ireland Life and Times survey. You see, for example, that in 2010, well over 80% of all groups agree that what Northern Ireland needs in the future is mixing. That if the groups actually interacted, things would get better. But Oziak and we argue that the problem in Northern Ireland is nobody knows how to mix. It sounds easy, but we don't know how to institutionally create patterns of mixing where people actually interact. People are relatively positive that both in the last 5 years, a majority of people, Protestants slightly less than Catholics, they think that things got better between 2005 and 2010. And they also think that the next 5 years will get generally better, although here we can see Protestants are much less likely to think things are getting better than they're slightly more likely to think things are going to remain the same. But notice very few people are predicting things are going to get worse. So overall, these are quite positive attitudes to think about your society in relationship to the communal divide. One of the interesting things that has happened is the failure of unionists to be able to transfer their identity to the youngest generation. This is a cohort analysis by who you identify as. And if you look at the first color of blue, the lighter shade of blue are people who identify as unionists. In the oldest age cohort, above 65, you see that more than 50% of people in Northern Ireland above 65 identify as unionists. People 18 to 24, college-age students and a little older, less than 20% do. Now there's way more than 20% Protestants. This means that more than half of the young people who are Protestant in Northern Ireland don't identify themselves as unionists. What this means is unclear. And there's going to be lots of research done, I think, in the next 4 or 5 years about this. Some argue that the traditional symbols of unionism, orange parades and sashes and all the rest, just doesn't appeal to young people today in Northern Ireland who want a little more hip meaning for unionism maybe than their grandfather's sense of unionism that is still resonating to the older generation. But it's quite striking how unionists are in the midst of a bit of a need to reformulate their own sense of identity in a way that can be transferred effectively to the youngest age cohorts. Lesson 8. Peace processes require intense engagement with issues. What we're arguing here is that, constructivists in IR talk a lot about the role of agency, that people make a difference. The peace process in Northern Ireland didn't happen as an accident. There were lots of people, from the leaders to advisors to even citizens who were willing to make important contributions to the peace process. So peace process, people have to want peace in order to achieve it. It doesn't happen randomly or accidentally. And we could spend some more time, I'm running out of time, so I'll keep moving here. Lesson 9, peace process should support moderates who are not outflanked by spoilers or critics of the peace process. In the IR literature, there's lots of talk about how you make sure spoilers don't spoil the peace process. What we mean by spoiler is people who don't want the peace and who are trying to sabotage the efforts of those who do try to achieve peace, right? So even if there's a nice leader on one side and a nice leader on the other, and they're really trying to work it out, if somebody else just starts lots of bombings or other uses of violence, they can break down those negotiations. How do you prevent those who are trying to sabotage the peace from doing that? This was tricky. You had to bring basically the extremes in, and there was lots of work done. One effort was to clearly support the moderates. In this image, you see the winners of the Nobel Prize in 1998, Trimble on the left, Hume on the right, by, I guess, the Irish Universal man, Bono. Right? This was a concert that Bono and U2 gave to try to convince people in Northern Ireland to ratify the agreement in 1998. And even though these guys are moderates, that you would think they would actually get along, according to the story of the actual concert, they came from different sides of the stage, never talked to each other, and actually never touched. Bono's body was the only way that they connected. You know, he was unifying the Protestant Catholic sides of Northern Ireland. It's depicted, and I don't know how important his concert was, but this symbolized the attempt to try to support the moderates. But what we've seen in Northern Ireland is an incredible case of how the extremists have learned to share power, and how these people, and these two figures here, when the institutions of the Northern Ireland Executive were reestablished in 2007, this man, Ian Paisley, famously known as Dr. No, because he said no to any kind of peace forever, finally said yes, and he shared power with Martin McGuinness, who you saw earlier when he was shaking the Queen's hand. These two represent the political extremes. Their parties were historically the extremes. Now they've learned to share power. They've become the two largest parties of the Protestants in Northern Ireland and the Catholics in Northern Ireland. So the extremes became more popular and learned to share power. This sounds good. One warning. There's still a potential problem of spoilers. What if you're a Protestant and you think the DUP, Dr. No, sold you out? Who represents you now in Northern Ireland? Nobody. A political entrepreneur could emerge to try to take advantage of that opening in Northern Irish politics. And we saw with a recent episode with a flag controversy how there is a base of support that goes beyond the current DUP's politics, the more extremist party. And similarly, there's talk about how there is support for what are called dissident Republicans. Republicans who think, you know, Martin McGuinness and Gerry Adams sold them out, that they agreed to share power. They want United Ireland, and they want to bomb their way to get there. How do we prevent the reemergence, in a sense, of violent paramilitaries that might take advantage of that vacuum? Those are huge issues Northern Ireland confronts. The final lesson, and I'll stop quickly because I think I'm over time, is that this incident, structural factors make a difference. Structural factors internationally that happen as well as domestically make a difference. And in chapter 10, Robert Snyder of Southwestern University primarily focuses on the end of the Cold War. And he builds his argument on an argument that was first developed by Robert Cox at the London School of Economics, who argued that the end of the Cold War forced the IRA and Sinn Féin to reorganize their ideology. They could no longer sell themselves as some kind of vanguard, Marxist-inspired socialist party. It didn't have any attractiveness. That era of revolutionary nationalism ended, and a more pragmatic civic nationalism was a much more attractive option. So the IRA had to sort of reformulate itself, and that led them to a more peaceful process. It's also important to note that domestic circumstances changed. By the 1990s, when we're starting to negotiate the Good Friday Agreement, The Republic of Ireland becomes a more attractive negotiating partner. The Celtic Tiger period of economic growth happens, they become rich, they become a place that everybody wants to be Irish at that point because it's rich. They've created this new sort of economic set of policies which makes sense in the new era of economics, supposedly. It's going to bring all kinds of wealth to Ireland. So the Unionists don't look at the Republic as some kind of bunch of poverty-driven papists or whatever. It's now this kind of cool, wealthy, postmodern country that they want to become linked with in a more meaningful way. So it allowed Unionists to recalculate who they were negotiating with when they thought about relations with the Republic of Ireland. So this is images of the end of the Cold War. And finally, 2001 and September 11th was critical because it put pressure on the IRA to decommission. On August 11th, 2001, it was revealed that the IRA had been training FARC rebels in Colombia. And Haas, as our envoy, had agreed to meet Adams and McGuinness on 9/11. And he met them right after the towers fell. And he went ballistic, telling them that they could no longer support revolutionaries in places like Colombia, and they needed to decommission their weapons. And sure enough, the first act of IRA decommission happens in October 2001. That this really